Assessing leadership is what I see as often a first step or a grounding tool in professional development, leadership development, where we are going to help guide a conversation, to help guide a development plan.
Welcome back to Relationships at Work, the leadership mindset guide for creating a workplace we love. I'm your host, Russel, a communications and leadership nerd with a couple of decades of experience and a whole heap of curiosity on how we can make the workplace a better place. If you found yourself as a leader trying to understand and improve your impact on work culture and the employee experience, well, you are in the right place. One place that many of us look to when we're stuck, or maybe we're trying to determine what our next steps should be, could be in our leadership journey, it's assessments. Now, I love assessments. If you're a regular listener of the podcast, you know how big of a fan I am of self-awareness. And assessments are just an amazing tool to help with that. Self-awareness is essential in being a great leader. So why wouldn't we look for areas to help with that? There are so many tools to leadership assessment. I know personally I've done Myers-Briggs, DISC, Insights, Strength Finder, probably more. It's all a blur, either through the organization I was with or some of them I've done personally. I know I ponied up the money even, was it last year I think I did for Strength Finder? I'm sure you're the same. It's a curiosity thing. We have that in common. They each tell different things too. They each look at different things in your help in your self-reflection. I know I did one recently that I actually didn't even agree with. I'm like, I'm not that guy. That is not me. I agree with all this part, but that part, I'm going to retake the test again. You know what? I never retook the test. I sat on the information. I marinated a little bit. I thought it over. Oh, wait, I might be a little bit of that guy. It's a little humbling when you have this information looking you in the face and you really have to do some self-reflection about that self-reflection. And that's what I love about these tools and what I think helps get the most out of them. It's a journey. It's even a journey with the information you're given, just analyzing it and thinking it over and not just accepting it right away. You know, it's a journey. But how can they help leaders within an organization? How can we get leadership on board to support them, operationalize them? Why should they? And where do tools fall down when it comes to being effective? I have these questions. And my guest today, very generous with answers. Jen Hope is an assessment expert and has worked really closely, specifically partnering with the DISC assessment on how to make these work. She's got some interesting insights I really, really want to share with you that you might even want to consider for your own team, your own organization. Hold on. And on the show today, we have Jen Hope, and here is why she is awesome. She's a leadership and business development coach, helping those leaders be more intentional in how they show up and their impact on the workplace. She's worked with companies such as Amazon, Oracle, DocuSign. Her background includes more than 2 decades of roles in marketing leadership, keynote speaking, and she has certification in various leadership assessments, which is real handy today because that's what we're going to be talking about. Hello, Jen.
Hello.
Thanks for being here. Excited to get into assessments. I think leaders need to really understand how they're good and how they're horrible. And I think there's that self-awareness piece that assessments can really help with. And that's why I'm super stoked to have you here because I have so many questions, Jen. But before we do, I want to start with the question I ask all of my guests, which is, what is your best or worst employee experience?
So I will start by saying I have this experience in leadership coaching. In addition to the work that I've done in that kind of corporate startup environment, I also spent time as a side hustle teaching group fitness. And the world of group fitness is very interesting as it relates to onboarding employees. They do it regularly. And you think with quite a bit of practice, we have a lot of, this is an early part of my career. And I will say it was a bit like what we may have imagined in a retail environment where the door is, unfortunately, there's a lot of employee churn in that environment. And I think one of the most difficult parts of an experience that I had was being given on my first day a headset and a template and a room full of 40 people. I had a playlist, which I had created myself, and I was on mic, right? And didn't have the experience that I have these days of being on mic. And in so many ways, so grateful to have spent those times being on mic on the fly, and can now do this here today with less of the concern and less of the worry. But it was a wild world to walk into a room and say, press play and go. And that's what I did. That's what I got to do. And that was the first of one of, it was difficult and it worked out well environments.
So you walked in there with very little direction, no understanding what the expectations were of what you were to deliver. What did you take away from that moment that you'd have to then be iterative moving forward?
What did I take from it? I knew more than I thought I did, for one. I also really understood that we were going to need to be flexible, and we were going to need to look to things that I knew from my past and move without the direction, which is something I have done in the past. I've gone into roles with ambiguity, and the expectations were serve the clients, be safe, right? Provide something safe to these folks. And it was more of, we really trust you. We've seen what you can do. You've brought your experience here. You've brought all the things that you know and your certification and your education. And we trust you to create an environment, and that you understand the brand and you understand the responsibilities of being in your role. So, fly.
Don't drown, fly.
Best of luck. Best of luck.
But it's so funny you bring that up, because we talk so much from a leadership perspective for our teams. Empower them. But that empowerment can be a double-edged sword if that person is not feeling equipped to be empowered or given the right direction to be empowered. So it's not just empowering, there needs to be some direction involved in it as well. Yeah.
And I think too, it's giving folks confidence, giving folks, the understanding that you have confidence in them is incredible. Again, to your point, role clarity. And I should say, was it completely without it? Oh, there was a format, there was a template. I had a sense of where things might go, and definitely, and a little bit frozen on the spot of, okay, we're doing this right now. Okay, we're in it today. Sounds good. Let's roll.
But there's that assumption that you do have the confidence. I mean, you certainly can find it in the moment, and certainly will have to find it in the moment. But to empower, I think it really comes down to leaders really understanding their staff of what their potential is, what they're not setting them up for success, that this actually is a good thing, which kind of leads very much into the topic we're talking about today, which is understanding who you are, understanding your impact on the workplace. And assessments are such amazing tools for that. I've certainly had a few assessments in my life and had varying degrees of success and or confidence in the results. And I'm super curious about your perspective on that. But before we get any further, I really like defining things before we get into any part of this conversation. So first, before we start, can we define what assessing leadership is?
The assessing leadership is what I see as often a first step or a grounding tool in professional development, leadership development, where we are going to help guide a conversation, help guide a development plan, and say, let's gather some information, gather some data that helps us start to make sense, and also start to define for this individual or a group or a collective, a team, what are the themes that we're seeing, and what are then the strengths? What are potential opportunities for growth? What are some of, again, some of the defining characteristics that make this person how they do what they do and what they do their best, and some of the motivations. And so for me, it's often a starting point where we're saying, hey, let's get to some information. Let's see how resonant it is for you in your lived experience, in your professional experience. And then let's guide from that. Okay, what do we glean? What are some opportunities? And then let's set that forward goal. So at a starting point, it's self-awareness, and it's a grounding opportunity to the big picture of the work.
What are we assessing, Jen? Because leadership is
Oh, great
it's one of
question.
my least favorite words, because everybody has their own definition of what leadership is. Every organization has a definition of what leadership is. They never communicate it, but they do tend to have the
That's
word
true.
thrown around a lot. So what are we
Yeah.
actually assessing? Because I know there's so many varying different tools.
Yeah. So in my mind, I work quite a bit with two tools. I'm pretty deep and pretty loyal to a tool called DISC, which a lot of folks have seen. The particular provider I am, more biased to, because I've seen the decades and decades of research that they've done and how they've standardized it and how they continue to build it out. And that is what we're doing there, is we're understanding behavior, which is that observable. This is how we do what we do. And that leaves out part of the conversation around motivation. And it is really intended as a separate conversation, because this is the impact that we have when we are working with folks. This is that observable outside picture. That is one aspect of understanding your leadership. The bigger picture, to me, again, is more tool based in what it's doing. Leadership Circle is what I'm talking about. And Leadership Circle provides us with a set of 18 competencies of leadership. And those would be the 18 things that, if we can build out a skill set around them, that we are working with, like what they call generative leadership, right? So it's the leadership tools and leadership competencies that are getting us to scale, that are getting us to growth, that are providing folks who work around us with a sense of trust and a sense of knowing that they're working with someone who's authentic and integrous. And what they have is a map, essentially, that guides us away from some of those reactive things that we all have and we all do, and points us in a direction that says, hey, we can take these kind of reactive tendencies that we all show up with and point them another direction if we can get out of our own way, self, story, and point ourselves in a more effective direction. So in that world, I have a definition of how we could break down those competencies and give myself and folks who I work with and organizations that I work with a bit of a definition. So we can at least be speaking the same language across the board, and about this kind of topic that, as you said, is like pretty ambiguous.
Who's doing the testing, Jen? Because I know a few, like StrengthsFinder, I paid the money and I went through that whole process, but that was all very about me. Other organizations do it for their employees. Is it HR? Is it executive? Who's doing this? Who's responsible for these assessments?
It's both. I would say it's individual leaders in larger organizations bringing in this type of work for their teams. This is where they're, putting their development budget. For others, it is HR. They're running programs. I would say in some of the like SMB clients that I work with, it's a CEO. It's somebody in that C-suite who's bringing in a tool to kind of like collectively provide us with some information.
Okay, so I guess the big question I have to ask too is why? So we're doing these assessments. What is the
Yeah.
benefit of doing this?
For a lot of folks, we have been given leadership responsibilities. And I would say, 75, 80% of folks couldn't give you a definition of leadership. And so what we're doing is saying, hey, here's a tool. Here is some information. Here is a language that we're going to use across team organization to give ourselves a North Star around management, around individual development, professional development, around what we wish this organization to be, in the same way that we would define brand, and in the same way that we would define product. We're giving something more grounded to this thing that we call leadership.
So when should this?
Is this unbelievable?
Is,
Is that
I was nodding and
to you?
smiling. I was nodding and smiling. But here's where here's where my fear is, Jen, is that C-suite, that CEO goes, we're going to bring in Disc. They bring in Disc. Hey, we did Disc 7 years ago. Remember Disc? It seems like this one-off thing that they never follow up on, that is a checked box exercise. Meanwhile, so much can change. So much can, your priorities, your values within an organization can change. So it seems like it's this tool that is done once, and then we can just point to it later on, not something we do consistently. What would you say to organizations that approach it like that?
I mean, it's the equivalent of you come in and we do the assessment and you put it away in a drawer, right? Those are not the folks who I think are truly invested, right? When you've got real buy-in, what I've seen organizations do is start with executive teams, and we're going to go in and we're going to really build it in to a leadership team. And so everyone on the team has done DISC. We've done multiple workshops at the executive level about DISC, about what do we make of the results? What do we make of the gaps? And where we've hired folks who kind of fall under into a couple of categories, right, around behavior or preferences around behavior. And then we build it throughout the rest of the organization. And now we're doing DISC with everyone who lands in the organization. And we're continuing that process as our teams evolve, as leadership evolves. We continue to iterate on it. And we continue to build it into both onboarding and into the employee experience. So everyone who's in that organization has seen it, understands it, and knows how to make adaptations through that lens.
Should this be a huge part of the hiring process as well?
I have mixed feelings on.
Bring it. Tell me what you think about that.
I think relying on it as truly a decision-making tool, I'm not sure about. Because we can find bias for folks who are like us. And I'm not sure that's what we're really looking for in that process.
I always, in the back of my head, do have the diversity, inclusivity, equity thoughts around, okay, I understand your organization wants to hire people that have the same values as the organization. But what does that look like? Is it an older white male? Because if you're sticking to a certain tool to assess a certain type of person, you're going to start seeing the same thing in the mirror probably over and over again. And that is not the road to innovation. That is not the road to EIB. So could it be possibly a suite of tools? Does it need to be one assessment? I totally hear where you're coming from, but also there is a culture fit conversation that needs to be a part of this too.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this. I am not the expert on the best way to hire around diversity, equity, inclusion. I don't have the depth that I know so many others do on this topic. I do know that even with something like behavior, I have seen organizations end up in bias. DISC, one of the factors in a DISC assessment is where do we show up around influence? And that is essentially like extroversion and introversion. That's a very simplified definition of it, but that's the preferences that we have around trust. And we can find organizations who, essentially over-index in certain directions. And that is because we are, as an executive team, we prefer extroversion. And so in our organization, we look for folks and see folks who are talking at a rapid pace, who are kind of hyperverbal, if we find someone in the interview process who is more reflective, is that affecting how we're making some of these decisions? So is there an answer to these are the exact tools to use to build out something more diverse? I don't think I have that answer. I would I wouldn't I wouldn't put my expertise and the experience I have in how organizations use these tools once folks have been brought in instead of that being a more predictor, instead of it being a predictive index of success.
Well, it's a fair comment considering, I mean, we're really just talking about data points of understanding, and what you do with that data is completely for good or for bad. So it's really
Yeah.
just having that understanding. So I want to dig into your experience of assessment. How have you seen leaders, frontline staff, employees, colleagues, as they better understand themselves through an assessment like this? How has it improved or been horrible for their understanding of their impact in the workplace, employee experience, culture? What do they do with that data?
So one of the first things that they do is they have two ways that they're taking in information. One is this kind of quantitative opportunity to look at, here's data based on, in some cases, a couple hundred years of studying human behavior and some of the most recent research around leadership and what we would call like creative leadership. And you can call that the most successful tools that we would need to be a leader. And I would say they start with the quantitative. So we just look at information. And then we have this opportunity in the tools that I use to also take this qualitative information, some of the descriptors. If we're doing a 360, we get the opportunity to take in the words that others are using. And I think of it a bit like a market research. I was a marketer for 15, 18 years before I started doing this work. And I take that as a bit of market research and present it as market research that says, we went out in the world and we gathered some information, and what do we glean from that information to help us apply some of this language to our leadership, right? To our brand, right? In our customers' words, how would they describe the value that we bring? And we can do the same thing in the qualitative part of something like a DISC report, where we're getting some descriptors and we can say, oh, that really rings true for my brand, or that rings true for when I know true to be true about myself. Here are some edits that I would make because this feels a little bit more authentic to me. And we can start to own pieces of that.
What does it mean to your team as a leader? So you've been through an assessment. What do you think it means to know that your leader, your supervisor, is taking this seriously, that is going down this path of trying to understand themselves?
I mean, in the world of leadership competencies, this checks the box of, am I a personal learner? That's kind of step one. Am I a personal learner? If we're taking the time to do this, okay, we've checked that box. We apply this to something like feedback. Here I am. I'm starting this conversation with, which I'm assuming great leaders are going to be wanting to have a two-way conversation about feedback. And this is a point where we're saying, and especially in a public environment where we're letting our team kind of participate in this growth, we're saying, here's an opportunity for feedback. I am confident enough. I am willing to be vulnerable enough to be this candid and say, these are the things that I am working on at the moment. And we are safe here to have that discussion. That's what I gather. What do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I think it's understanding that your boss is, I shouldn't say boss, leader, hopefully. If they're a boss, your assessment didn't come off so great. I think it's important for your team to understand that you have a growth mindset, that you are not fully baked when you come into a role, and that you're constantly trying to learn. And one of the biggest pieces you can learn is about yourself. I think one of the biggest challenges or mistakes that assessment can happen is you keep the information to yourself. Is that I learned my values. They're all mine. I'm not telling anybody else. then how do we know to interact with you? How do we know what motivates you? How do we know what's important to you if you keep this all to yourself? So you understand yourself, but we don't understand how to work with, around, above you. So I think teams having that, as you say, part of the process, I think is astronomically important to help with connection. I think it's absolutely helpful to help with collaboration, to help them get curious about their own way of working. I think it's nothing but a way of ripples in a pond, right? Model the behavior you want. And I think assessing your leadership and making it a priority models the behavior that we would want from our own teams and trying to make them leaders as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have to be doing that in an environment where it's safe to do so. And I would say that is the norm and not where, somebody's doing this work, and there are plenty of organizations where to say that I am working with a coach or doing this assessment work is not something that would be shared in a group or even in a team amongst peers. It is seen as weakness. And that's not my thoughts on it at all. I think it's an incredibly brave part of being a leader. And if anything, it is like you're saying, it is a commitment to being someone who's ready to do growth. But in organizations, I don't know that we've made that leap yet. As you're saying, like in something where we'd see what I would call some of the dated leadership values, that's not the case.
I'm hopeful. I think a lot of organizations are starting to lean a lot more. We're having a lot more conversations about DEIB. We're having a lot more conversations about psychological safety. That wasn't even a word that was barely used 3-4 years ago. And now in any leadership conversation, it's the DNA we need to even start with for change. But you bring up some really good points about roadblocks, about challenges organizations can bring to the table, talking about assessments, saying they're going to implement it, but then maybe not being the right culture to be bringing this in, not being ready.
Yeah.
What are some red flags or canaries in a coal mine that organizations should be looking for to think, you know what, maybe we're not quite ready to do things like this?
I think the common one is we start assessment work at the senior leadership level, but not C-suite. That happens quite a bit, where we can get the rest of the organization started on this process and it doesn't make its way into an executive suite. I'm always, that gives me pause just on, I think you probably understand why. That's one of the red flags for me. Seeing, like you've talked about, a very short program. We do work for 12 weeks versus we've got a bigger plan of kind of weaving this into our entire employee experience. Those would be the ones that stand out to me.
So how do you get them on board? I mean, there's executive that will go, so are we assessed yet? Great, checkbox. I can put it in for this quarter that we did such a thing. Meanwhile, they're not being part of the party. They're part of the problem, not part of the transformation that the organization's trying to go through this tools. From an assessment standpoint, just from the outside looking in, do you go, you know what? I'll see you in about 2 years. Or is there something you can do, or even HR can do, to convince organizations that this is important to do for everybody?
Sometimes it is a matter of let's show, not tell. And let's create an environment where we get folks talking about it, right? We're doing our own internal marketing around the program. And that can change things as we see leaders evolve. That can change things. And so we can do internal marketing. It's one of the suggestions that I would make. And we can do some of what you said, which is, so let's wait a year, let's wait 2 years and do this when the organization is ready to kind of address through all parts of the organization what might be under the surface, and really taking a close look at it. So we can get, I've seen great scenarios too, where we get a couple of folks brought in and from that executive team and willing to bring this into different parts of the organization. We've got a CMO who's built it into their entire org. Great. That's a great place to start. And then we can start the conversation there.
We kind of touched on it, but I just want to be clear here. How frequently do you think is the sweet spot for doing this? Is it onboarding? Is it every couple of years? How frequently should we be assessing our leadership?
When we have teams that are changing by like more than 30, 40% is a great point. So if we're adding folks, when we've got folks, as we do, leaving organizations or changing teams, that's the point to do it for a team. And as far as when to do it big picture, or I do think in the onboarding is ideal, wonderful. And what we can do from there is for a leader, no sooner than a year, hopefully pushed out a bit from there, 18 months, something like that.
Say you go through the assessment process and say you don't agree with the results. What do you do? Do you just go, maybe I don't know myself so well? Or do you get all stubborn and go, nope, take it again, take it again? What is the best way to approach that information?
Oh, I'm happy to let people take it again. What I see sometimes in that process is while they want to see particular parts of the report change, in a second or third assessment, they often double down on the thing that they really didn't want to double down on. And let's see, what else? I think one of the parts of that aspect of understanding reports, and this is important to me, and this is also one of the reasons that I work with the provider for DISC that I work with, part of this comes from the way that we debrief the information. This is one of the reasons, to me, I spend so much time with the individual talking about their report and their results, because in its black and white version that you're looking at on your screen, we interpret so much of this as either judgments or the statements themselves have some value applied to them, right? Like if I am a high I, well, even just the word high could tell us or provide us with information, or our interpretation of it can say that is somehow good, bad, right? But there really isn't value associated with that. It's a descriptor that is just about where a number is on a graph. And so to me, the way to work through some of that is working with someone who really can help folks understand that this is all behavior on a spectrum and that we're all going to have limitations. And what it can do is be a bit of a guide and a bit of a way to kind of peek around corners to say, like, on my worst day, I'm going to be mindful that my behavior could come across as aloof, right? And, or on like when I'm too stressed or when I get too comfortable, I can be the person who is in the weeds on minutia versus the big picture, right? And it's a way of saying something a lot more in a way that can be hopefully neutral about our behavior or about the things that we do that really well or need to work on, and not push people into a corner, which if we're pushing folks too hard, I find that we get that reaction, right? And if we're working with folks in a way where they find themselves judging themselves, that's where we get that. That's where we get this is BS. And I'm too flooded and I'm too overwhelmed by my own kind of shame or embarrassment about some of these things that we all have, which is limitations.
There's a lot of different tools. I mentioned Strength Finder earlier. I know Insights is another one.
Yep.
Breckenmeyer, I can always forget that one. There,
Briggs? Yep.
Myers-Briggs. Wow, could I have not screwed that up more? Myers-Briggs, you're an innovator. You're a theater nerd. There was just all those personas you have to do with that one. I know you're quite into disc or very much involved in disc. So is the process pretty much the same? Is it answer a bunch of questions, we'll assess you based on those questions, we'll give you the results? Every one I've done is pretty much the same. It's just looking at different things. Is that,
Yeah.
and what are we looking for? How does that process work?
Yeah. So it's a 10-minute assessment. It is meant to be taken quickly because we don't want to spend too much time in analyzing what we determine to be the right answer. We want your gut answer. And from there, you're going to get an insights report. And like I mentioned, it'll have qualitative information as well as quantitative information. And what it's giving you is what would be considered an outsider's perspective about an observable description of your behavior and what folks on the outside can take in about you.
So you get your results. As you mentioned earlier, it really depends on how those results are presented to you and walk through them for you. Yeah. Now, what do you do with them? From an operational standpoint, how do you operationalize this? Because the next assessment will be down the road, as you said, but now you have these results. Do you do regular check-ins? Do you try to connect the dots?
Yeah.
What's the operational view of this?
Yeah. So I would say the next step is a debrief in my ideal world. And I think in the ideal world of these reports, as a debrief is a conversation with someone who can take you through and help you really tease out what are the 1 to 2 things that I'm gleaning from this information and create a development plan. So you're working with, let's look 6 months out, let's get some stakeholders. So let's get 5 folks who work either that are your leaders, folks who are working on your team, your peers. And again, this is folks in who we really trust, right? These are the folks who, if I'm recommending to someone, they're going out into the world and asking folks to buy in on their development process, it is folks that they trust. That is not always how this works. But if I had my little magic wand, that would be who we get involved in that process, is folks who really are invested in your development. And then we're working to 6 months out. At 90 days, we're checking in. We can check in with some of those stakeholders. We can check in with ourselves. We can do a check-in, hopefully, with the person who is doing this assessment work and leading it to check our progress. And then again, we're doing a year out. And that's when we can see folks who are not as up close with our work maybe start to take notice. And that's a long time. I will set the stage and say it's not overnight, and it is an investment. An organization has to get behind it. A leader has to get behind it. An individual has to get behind. This is something that I can see the value of, and I'm willing to, over 6 months, really dive in and think about where can I adapt? Where are some very specific places that should I want to, or should the need be there, that I can adapt? And at that year point is where we see, okay, I can look back a year ago and say, a full season ago, I have really come a long way.
You easily led me to my next question, because you touched on the organization. A lot of what you're talking about is the person's role in following up with their mentors, their network. Where's the organization in this? They know their leaders are taking these assessments. They know it's happening out there. But what's the role of the organization to create an environment of support in that operationalization?
Yeah, I mean, it again depends on where this is coming from. If this is HR, what support are we putting in place? What is the program that builds underneath this, that we are getting folks either an ongoing education in these different topics, right? How are we bringing them a kind of like a leveled approach? So we started understanding ourselves, right? That's step one. Where down the road are we bringing in understanding others? Where down the road are we bringing in how does the system, which within with that we're working in, influence some of these elements as well? What are we doing as an organization that says, okay, we've gathered now some of the individual information, some of the team-based information. And this, I mean, in a perfect world, this goes the other way, right? We're understanding the environment we're creating first. That is not always the case. So if we're going this direction now, hopefully at some point in this process, we're looking at the big picture and saying, these are the values of our organization. And then there's the reality of what's happening in our organization. And this is, how do we live? What do we allow in our environment? And that is that's hopefully the initial investment. And it's what I would say, a table stakes to making this the start of this program successful.
So where are the gaps? You've been doing these assessment tests for a while. What is something are we not set up really to assess with these tools that maybe we should be looking at more? I'm kind of curious as to what you think. Assessments, nothing's perfect. No tool is absolutely end all and be all. What do we need to also be considering as we assess leadership?
Neurodiversity that's not there. That's something that is on my mind regularly with these assessments. I don't have a solution for it, but I know that's something that we need to be mindful of. Judgment and how we assess the way that we're looking at this in an international environment, or also just the different ways that cultures show up, and that we're still gathering that information through this observable, biased US version of what leadership is. And so I think there's a lot of limitation around that. And so that's something that's on my mind day to day.
I'm also thinking to something you mentioned earlier, which is the bias side of things, because I can see say we get 20 people, we all get assessed, and you notice that 10 of them are over here on this chart, and there's these 2 other people that are different results. Maybe they're more analytical, maybe they're more whatever, they're outliers. I can see bias going, yeah, those guys are going to be problem. They're not like us, as opposed to going, this feels like it should be more well-rounded and not look at them as outliers.
We put all of our employees on a circle, right? And we all have different points kind of like within this graph. Our ideal is not to have it like perfectly divided. That's just generally speaking, not how that works. What we can be aware of is that if we have folks who prefer to work in a really fast-paced environment, and that is part of the bias, and we've got folks on one side, and yeah, we'd love to run at a sprint, and then we can have folks on the other side who, prefer something a bit slower, more methodical. We can be aware that we're going to have a bias in that direction, right? And these folks over here, the value that they bring is slowing us down, is the methodical approach that they could take, is the questions that they're going to ask about change, and the focus that they may have on the team members. When this group may be like, I'm only focused on the task. And so what we can do is, if we're looking at the collective, we have the insight to say, we could be over-indexed here. And what we can do about it is really lean on the folks, and not that it's their job, but have an awareness that like, if those voices are not as heard as they should be, then we have a role to adapt, right? These fast pacers have the work to do to adapt. How does that sit with you?
It does. It's making me think about how we can set ourselves up for success before we even take these assessments. So say before you even come into an organization, what are you hoping an organization has done before you walk through that door?
I think what we can know are some of those kind of general descriptors or tendencies, I guess is how I would say it, that say this is a fast moving organization and we know that. And we are looking intentionally to bring in some folks who understand that while this is how we are today, this is what we aspire to be. And we're putting effort into that. And we are intentionally working on XY topic, right? We know this about ourselves and we're hoping to make shifts in that area. I think when you start, okay, I'll apply this to the dating world for just a moment. If we go into the dating world and we're like, we have no red flags, we definitely have red flags. And the red flag in that starting point is we don't have the self-awareness to know the stuff that's going to get in our way. Versus we show up and we're like, okay, here are the things that I've learned in therapy with a coach in my own reading. And these are the ways that I've kind of messed up in my previous relationships, or the parts of it that were my responsibility. To me, that's the relationship I'm looking for, is the person who can show up and say, like, here's my BS, and I'm pretty clear on it. And I know how that might affect a partner and a relationship. Quite similar to me. If I hear an organization that's telling me we know some of the things that we can do better, that's a second date.
I love that you tied it back to relationships, considering the name of the podcast. So it's about everything. I get it. I'm full circle, Jen. I really appreciate that. And it comes back to the very first thing we did here, which is defining things. Because you can't come in here and go, we haven't defined success. We haven't even told you what leadership means. If we haven't got that, we're singing from the same song sheet or defining what success even looks like before we do a thing, I think that's a big red flag for not getting. You don't know what success looks like if you don't define it ahead of time.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So Jen, the last question, I've loved this conversation. The last question I have to ask, which is, what's one simple action people can do right now to improve their relationships at work?
I would say that idea of we all have limitations, and being in a place where we can find the acceptance and the kindness for ourselves to say, these are flaws that also make the thing that we do so amazing, right? There's going to be the way that we work and all of the benefit that brings that's to be celebrated. Because on the flip side of all of these things that could potentially get in our way are all of our gifts. They're just our gifts overextended, right? And so what we're doing and what we do when we build out a skill set and look at some of this information is give us more flexibility, is give us a screwdriver and a hammer and a set of wrenches in addition. And so looking at this through the eyes of a really generous inner world is what I would say. Great starting point.
That is Jen Hope. She's a leadership assessment expert, leadership and business development coach, and she has just shared a couple of truth bombs for us today. Thank you so much, Jen.
Thank you.
That's it. That's all. We are done. Another Relationships at Work podcast episode is in the books. My name is Russel Lolliker. Love spending time with you. Love that we share this curiosity gene. Sure, let's get sciencey. But needless to say, I love that we spend this time together and really appreciate you being so generous with your time. Before you go, I do want to ask a little bit more of your time. If you have a moment and you're on the Apple podcast app, yeah, that's it, or the Spotify podcast app, I have a favor to ask. If you could scroll down and there's a ratings and review area, 5 stars, that'd be great. And a review, a little comment on how you've enjoyed the show, what it's meant to you, how you found it valuable. Could not appreciate it more. It's just a really nice way for the podcast to be found. Those directories really value that information. So Really, really appreciate it if you take the time to do so. Anyway, that's it. I will leave you to it. Take care.